Pagbati sa inyo mga kapatid at mga kaibigan sa pangalan ng ating Panginoong Hesukristo sa pagpapatuloy ng ating pag-aaral sa ating Sunday School ng Paksang Christian Holiness. Tayo pa rin ay nasa bahagi na pinag-aaralan natin ng adversarial forces at muli natin itong idugtong sa mga nagiging sagabal sa kabanalan matapos natin tingnan ng mahabang panahon ang means of grace. Ay tinitingnan natin ang mga nagiging sagabal dito na inumpisahan natin sa popular errors, at apat ang pinag-aralan nating popular errors: ang error of sinless perfectionism, ang error of hyper grace, ang higher life, at ang defeatism. At pagkatapos nito ay tiningnan natin ang tinatawag nating internal hindrances that short-circuit growth in holiness using this illustration of power supply for growth. Maaring may mga humadlang dyan at isa riyan ang legalistic thinking, ang unfocused living, at ganoon na rin ang dominant sinning. Pero may ikatlo pa tayong tinitingnan na nagiging hadlang at kasalungat ng pagpapakabanal, at ito ang tinatawag nating adversarial forces against holiness. These are rational beings that create opposition to holiness, at tatlo ang pinag-aaralan natin dito para sa ating paglago ng kabanalan, magiging salungat. Ang una ang demonic spirits, at ang ikalawa ay ang corrupting company, at ang ikatlo ay ang unruly brethren. Ang ikinaiba ng ikatlong sagabal na ito ay they have personal qualities not prominent in doctrinal errors and internal hindrances. Ito ay mga rational beings, mostly people, but last week we considered demonic powers or spirits. They are in the realm of evil spirits under Satan, at enmity with God and His people. At ang binigyang diin ko sa gawain ng mga demonyo, contrary to the common idea that the demonic is always supernatural, actually the main occupation of the demonic is deception. The main occupation of demonic work is to deceive God's people, to hinder His cause. Nakita natin ito nang magbabala si Pablo sa mga taga-Korinto, ang linlang na maaring bumalot sa kanila, at inihambing niya ito sa pinakaunang paninilang pa na ginawa ng Diablo doon sa Eden. So you can see that thousands of years have elapsed, yet Paul could still see the work of deception by the devil and his cohorts against God's people. Therefore, it is not the supernatural, though it has its place, but it is not the main occupation of the demonic, but rather deception. And how does the demonic operate in deception? Sa tatlong larangan: temptations, mga tukso, falsehood, mga kabulaanan, and then diyan papasok ang wonders, mga kababalaghan. And we said in summary of this section that we are fighting real powers. There can be no dismissive or contemptuous attitude to demonic powers, but they are already defeated by Christ. Therefore, our dealings with the demonic must be dependent upon the Lord Jesus Christ. Dadako tayo sa ikalawa na adversarial forces against holiness, at yan ang corrupting company. Tayo ngayon ay nasa mga katauhan na. And when we talk of the corrupting company, I mean association with unbelievers, where that association has a prevailing bad influence. Gusto kong simulan sa pagdidiin na ang mga mananampalataya ay may tungkulin na maglinang na magandang relasyon sa mga hindi mananampalataya. We are duty bound to nurture good relationship with unbelievers. Let us disabuse our minds from the two common errors that have been practiced and are still practiced by some Christians in relation to unbelievers. There is the error of withdrawal. May mga lumayo, nagsarili sa mga nakalipas, at may ilan pa sa panahon natin. And this is on the pretext that they might be contaminated by unbelievers. So they think the only way to avoid that is to have a community of their own, and that is wrong. It is interesting in the matter of discipline in 1 Corinthians 5, when Paul gave instruction na i-excommunicate ang isang miyembro ng iglesia na ayaw magsisi, and that means disassociation with him. But he gave this caveat in chapter 5, 9, and 10. I have written to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, but then not at all, meaning the people of this world who are immoral, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave this world. Yung ibig niya sabihin, habang nasa mundo ka, ay hindi mo maiiwasan na makisalimuha sa mga hindi mananampalataya kahit pa mayroon silang masamang karakter. The other error is they're not withdrawing, but their stance is what is called separatism. That is, having a minimalist involvement as far as the world is concerned. Ito ang mga tao na ang akala nila kaya lang sila nasa mundo ay para mag-soul winning, wala silang pagsisikap na magpakahusay sa kanilang mga panawagan. Palagay nila ito ay pakikipagkarera sa mga hindi mananampalataya na ayaw nilang gawin, which is a minimalist involvement, and that also is wrong. So we neither withdraw nor we separate in the sense of minimizing our involvement in the things of the world, dahil narito pa tayo sa mundo. Tandaan natin na believers have their own influence. Hindi naman one-way traffic ito na tayo lang ang nai-impluwensyahan. Tayo ay makaka-impluwensya, and probably the most important figures used in the scriptures by Jesus, no less, of the influence of believers towards unbelievers is that of being salt and light in this world. At ito ay nasa Sermon on the Mount na mga karakter na mga kabilang sa kanyang kaharian, and these figures are indicative of the manner of influence we can exert on unbelievers. Nang tawagin tayong salt, asin, ang function ng asin noon na wala pang refrigeration ay preservative. So it is to arrest the spread of decay on meat at iba pa. Well, ganito ang Kristiyano. Pigilin niya ang pagkalat ng masama, ng kabulukan sa lipunan o saan man siya may presensya, to arrest the evil. Halimbawang may corruption na nangyayari sa opisina, huwag siyang pahawa, huwag siyang gumaya, kundi hihinto sa kanya ang gawain ng katiwalian. That's salt, arresting evil, but that is not the only influence. There is a positive influence in the figure of light. Light is spreading the good of Christian presence. So wag kang masatisfy lang na hindi ka nakikisama sa kanilang mga masasamang gawain, kundi meron kang ginagawang impluwensyang nakabubuti sa iyong mga kasama. So isang bagay na tandaan natin, as we are still in this world, we cannot and should not avoid all company of unbelievers. Hindi natin maiiwasan at wag nating asahang iwasan ng ang pakikisama sa mga hindi mananampalataya. So that leads us to something that we must bear in mind, something to beware. There is a real danger of corrupting influence by a bad company. So having said that we cannot avoid company of unbelievers, we have to take note that some company is simply bad. May mga samahan sa mga hindi mananampalataya na masama ang kanilang impluensya. May ganitong sinita si Apostol Pablo in 1 Corinthians 15:33, "Do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character." Now, this is not original to Paul, or in the New Testament. Apostle Paul is in fact citing and quoting a pagan poet, Menander, and it became a well-known Greek proverb, which shows that this is not necessarily exclusively of Christian concern, kundi maging ang mga hindi mananampalataya ay iniisip ang mga uri ng samahan na kanilang kinabibilangan. As a matter of fact, pagan literature esteems highly good friendship. At isang magagamit natin dito na naging maimpluwensya sa kasaysayan ay ang sulatin ni Aristotle, the philosopher who was a student of Plato. He wrote probably one of the first books or a series of writings on ethics known as the Nicomachean Ethics. At sa kanyang sulatin na ito, 2 chapters are about friendship. So maging mga pagan philosophers, nakikita nila ang halaga ng friendship as having to do with ethics, having to do with right and wrong. There's a right way of doing it, there's a wrong way of doing it, and this is a matter that is true even of unbelievers. So we learn here that this is the wisdom of common grace. Hindi ito exclusively of Christian concern. Even decent unbelievers avoid bad company. Kung ginagawa yan, maski na mga hindi mananampalataya, ay lalo itong maging dapat na alalahanin ng isang mananampalataya na nagnanais na magpakabanal sa kanyang buhay. So we can see that there are two stances that we can have towards company of unbelievers. One is that friendship with unbelievers to be nurtured, and the other is that friendship with unbelievers to be avoided. Tingnan natin ang dalawang yan. What is that friendship with unbelievers that we are to nurture? Well, one premise is that the influence must be reciprocally good. That means both sides are profiting from the friendship in terms of influence of good. On the side of the believer, he is absorbing good influence from the unbeliever, and so with the unbeliever absorbing good influence for the believer. So we recognize good influence of common grace of unbelievers. Maaring may gawing mabuti sa atin ng mga hindi mananampalataya dahil sa karaniwang biyaya ng Diyos. May mga tinukoy na mga kaibigan si Pablo na nang siya'y nanganganib, siya ay iniingatan, the people in Acts 19:30 who were called Asiarchs. So they have a position in society, and yet they were friendly to the Apostle Paul. And here is another instance in Acts 27:3. The next day, Luke here is narrating, we landed at Sidon. And Julius was the centurion who was escorting Paul as a prisoner to Rome, but he was treating Paul kindly. He says in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. Hindi mananampalataya ito, pero we can say kinaibigan ni Pablo at naging mabuti, mabait sa kanya ang trato ng isang hindi mananampalataya. But let us not forget our own side of influence on the unbeliever we befriend. We exert Christian influence on unbelieving friends. And this is part of what James says in James 5:19 and 20. If you know someone who is departing from the truth by influence, you lead him away from error. And this is what we call Christian witness. It is a bad testimony to be reputed as unfriendly and withdrawn kapag ang mga kasama mo ay hindi mananampalataya, sa opisina man yan, sa iyong workplace, at ang nagiging reputasyon mo ay hindi ka pala kaibigan at lumalayo ka sa kanila, huwag mo isipin na ikaw ay nagiging mabuting Kristiyano. Masamang patotoo ang ganyan. At may sinabi sa Proverbs 18:1, a man who isolates himself seeks his own desire. He rages against all wise judgment. Ibig sabihin, selfish ang taong ito na nagsasarili lang. Of course, there is a time for solitude. I've always said that. Pero hindi ibig sabihin na sa buong pagkakataon ay nagsasarili ka at wala kang panahon na makipagkaibigan kahit sa mga hindi mananampalataya. So it is a blessing from the Lord to have unbelieving friends of good character. Kung meron kang ganyan, tanggapin mo na pagpapala sa Diyos at huwag mong isipin na dahil hindi siya mananampalataya ay hindi sa Diyos ang ganyang uri ng kaibigan. So one example that I can give here of friendship between a believer and unbeliever, on the one hand is George Whitfield, an English evangelist, perhaps the most successful evangelist in terms of fruitfulness ever. He crossed the Atlantic several times between Great Britain, England, and America. And when he is in America, he had a very good friend there who was very prominent but an unbeliever in the person of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was one of the American founding fathers, one of those who framed their U.S. Constitution. He was also a printer by business, and many of the writings of George Whitfield he volunteered to print, probably at a discount price. Franklin never became an evangelical believer. He was a believer in God, but he was a deist. Hindi siya naniniwala na ang Diyos ay involved sa mga bagay ng mundo. Hindi siya naniniwala sa ebanghelyo. Gayunman, naging mabuting kaibigan siya at naging pakinabang sila sa isa't isa. And this is an example where there can be friendship that is good, influence on both sides, the believer and the unbeliever. But let us consider the second part of this, friendship with unbelievers that is to be avoided. May mga bagay na hindi dapat ipagpatuloy, dapat iwasan. It is when the influence turns one-sided traffic from bad character. Kung ang impluensya ay nanggagaling lang sa hindi mananampalataya na nagiging masama ang impluensya sa mananampalataya, ito ay isang uri ng pakikipagkaibigan na hindi dapat ipagpatuloy. Marami tayong masasabi ng mga uri, but I just want to single out two that the scriptures, the book of Proverbs in particular, warns us against. Ang una ay a person characterized by anger. Do not make friends, Proverbs 22:24 and 25 says, with a hot-tempered person. Do not associate with one easily angered, or you may learn their ways and get yourself ensnared. So narito yung pagkakahawa, the infectious character of anger. Pag laging ganyan ang nagiging karakter ng iyong kasama, kaibigan, hindi magandang pakisamahan ang ganyang uri. Ang isa pa ay gossip, yung mahilig sa chismisan, kwento-kwento tungkol sa ibang mga tao. And Proverbs 16:28 says, a troublemaker plants seeds of strife. Gossip separates the best of friends. So in other words, a gossip is not a good friend. Remember, I've said before, he who gossips to you will gossip of you. Kung nakikichismis sa iyo, kahasahan mong itinichismis ka rin yan sa ibang mga tao, hindi magandang pakisamahan ang mga uri ng samahang nauuwi lang sa mga chismisan. And ingatan natin ito. Remember, some friendships, on the other hand, have potential of turning unequal yoking. This is a special kind of friendship when you become intimate with a person of the opposite gender and yet an unbeliever. So intimacy with an unbeliever of opposite gender has the makings of what the Bible warns very soberly as an equal yoking. How many times have we used 2 Corinthians 6:14? Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. Or for what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness? Pansinin ninyo na pinuntahan o binakas ni Pablo ang ganyang pagkakatambalan. Sa likod nito ay mga kapangyarihan ng kadiliman, ng kawalang pagsunod. So, mind the friendships you undertake, and there are friendships to be nurtured, but there are friendships to be avoided. To keep a friendship that is corrupting hinders holiness. Huwag mong isipin na ang kabanalan, sarili mo lang disiplina yon, walang magagawang iba kay magbuti o masama ang kanilang impluensya. And James makes this uh, mutually exclusive friendship with God is going to be unfriendly to those who are characterized by worldliness. On the other hand, friendship with the world will compromise your good relationship with God. So it's friendship with God or friendship with the world according to James chapter 4 and verse 4. So this is the friendship that is to be avoided. Again, to give you an example, terminating or not starting a bad company is part of plucking out and cutting off. Remember, this is the discipline of mortification, and part of plucking out the right eye and cutting off the right hand is terminating a bad company. And a good example here is Augustine. When Augustine was converted, he terminated his illicit love affair, a love affair that produced a son. And it is interesting, he named the son Deodatus, whom he loved. And when he died early, that is, the son died early in his teens, it was much to the grief of Augustine. But never in his many writings did he name the woman, so we do not know who the woman was, and he was concerned to hide his identity, her identity and reputation, mindful still of her good uh, reputation. But this is what he did. When he became a servant of Jesus Christ, he knew immediately that there is a relationship that cannot go on. So when it comes to corrupting company, it wasto natin ang ating pag-iisip. Anong mga bagay dapat ang ating ipanuri sa ating sarili. Tandaan natin, our company will have much to determine in the kind of character we build. Proverbs 13:20 says, "Walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm." So we have our company, and that company will have its effect on your character, and for Christians, on your holiness. So ang unang tanong sa panuri ng sarili ay, are you the influencer or easily influenced? Ikaw ba ang nag-iimpluwensya o ikaw ang madaling maimpluwensyahan? May mga tao na matatawag nating timid personality, nangingimi ang kanilang personalidad, and what happens is they only absorb and they do not assert. And that kind of personality will be recipient of influence, and sometimes bad influence, but they cannot influence themselves. Uh, and for these people, in fact, I would say for all believers, it is always advisable to have a predominance of Christian friends while we nurture good friendship with unbelievers. It is always advisable to have a predominance of Christian friends. May sinabi si Pablo tungkol kay Timoteo na may ganitong personalidad. He was of a timid personality, and Paul tells him, "Fan into flame the gift of God which is in you, for the Spirit of God gave us the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline." Ang leksyon dito ni Pablo ay, by grace, it is possible to overcome personality weaknesses. So sabihin naman natin na timid ka, nangingimi ka, ngunit sa biyaya ng Diyos, maaari mong daigin yan at maaari kang maging uh, ma mapagpahayag ng ebanghelyo, dahil yan ang sinabi ni Pablo following 2 Timothy 1:7, ay sinabi niyang, "Do not be ashamed of me nor of the gospel of Jesus Christ." Ang ikalawang tanong ay, can you distinguish common grace from depravity of unbelievers? You see, every unbeliever combines both the common grace as well as the depravity. But one will be dominant over the other. It's either common grace dominating depravity or depravity dominating common grace. And we call it common grace because, as I've always explained before, it is non-saving. So it is not saving grace. It is non-saving, and that includes good works, but we call them grace still because they are undeserved favor of God. Ay maaaring pinabayaan na lang sila ng Diyos sa sarili nilang kasamaan, ngunit nagbigay siya sa halip ng mga bagay na ikabubuti ng buhay. And that's why it's still grace, although common grace. But because it is grace, it is still the work of God, and right for us to appreciate God's work in a person even though he is an unbeliever. So a case here is that of Cornelius. Cornelius was a man, a Gentile, and a centurion, and yet was very devoted to religious matters. And one day, an angel appeared to him. And he, Cornelius, stared at him in terror and said, "What is it, Lord?" And he, the angel, said to him, "Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God." Now, what do we see here? We see here that his good works are commended. That doesn't mean those good works are saving, because Cornelius was advised to fetch Peter so that Peter may preach to him the gospel for his salvation. So that shows us even as good works are commendable because they come from God himself to an unbeliever, yet that unbeliever remains unsaved until he hears the gospel of salvation. So ganitong tingin natin sa mga hindi mananampalataya, maaring katulad sila ni Cornelius na maraming mga mabuting gawa, ngunit hindi natin iniisip na dahil doon sila'y ligtas, pero maaari tayong magkaroon ng mabuting relasyon sa kanila. Pero kung ang nangingibabaw ay ang kanilang kasamaan, ito naman ay dapat nating iwasan because that becomes corrupting company. So we can see God's work of common grace in unbelievers, but they remain totally depraved. And we need to distinguish the two and which one is dominating in any particular individual. So sa pag-iisip ng corrupting company, iwasto natin ang ating hubog ng isip. Ang tamang pag-iisip ay God's common grace is manifest even in unbelievers, but some are advanced in their depravity and are bad influence. So nagdi-distinguish ng common grace and depravity, and the result it will result in is I will nurture good influencing friendship with unbelievers, but I will avoid those who are corrupting in influence. Kung panatilihin natin ang ating nananatiling kasalanan, mahuhulog tayo sa dalawang extremes. Unbelievers are either just totally depraved or are good influences for me. So parang isa lang sa dalawa ang nakikita niya, and he will have the resolve again of two extremes. I will either totally avoid unbelieving company or just immerse myself in their company. So a person who does not make a distinguishing approach to unbelievers of different kinds will fall into this danger. Ang isipin natin na hamon nito, distinguish between good and corrupting influence of unbelievers. Tandaan natin ang mga samahan natin sa mga hindi mananampalataya ay maaring makabuti, maaring makasama sa atin. At ito ang ating pakaisipin na maging resolba natin. One of the adversarial forces we need to deal with is that of corrupting company. Kaya sa ating usapin ng kabanalan, huwag nating iwalang bahala ang ating mga samahang nasa paligid, dahil marami tayong mga kasama sa mundo, sa trabaho, na mga hindi mananampalataya, at alam natin dapat kung ano sila sa atin, sa impluensya nila, kung mabuti o nakasasama sa atin, at alang-alang sa kabanalan, gawin natin ang nararapat para sa mga samahan natin sa mga hindi mananampalataya. Maraming salamat sa inyong pakikinig. Sana kayo ay nakinabang at muli sumainyo ang pag-ibig ng Ama, ang biyaya ng kanyang anak na si Jesucristo at ang pakikipisan ng banal na Espiritu.